My name is Idan Rakovsky. I'm an Avrech at Beit Midrash Zichron Dov. Beit Midrash Zichron Dov. You know what? Let me also add this to my name as it appears on the in your here in the Zoom. So you will also remember where I come from. So it's Beit Midrash Zichron Dov. This is a community Beit Midrash, which is an affiliation, a joint affiliation by YU, Yeshiva University, and the organization called Torah Mitzion, which is under the World Mizrahi. And I'm also the rabbinic assistant in Congregation Sha'arei Tefillah. And I came from Israel, if you heard this conversation, from a kibbutz called Masuot Yitzchak. This is a kibbutz in southern Israel. Very, very tiny, small place. I'm not expecting anyone, only Ruchama, to know where that is. But if Bezrat Hashem, if you're coming to Israel soon and you're looking for a trip, for a tour around the kibbutz, a real kibbutz, you can see the cows, you can see the chickens, you can see everything like it was. Just no dining room and no dormitories for the children, but everything is the same. Just let me know and we'll arrange a free special tour in a kibbutz in Israel. So this is also something that I can take care of. And at that note, we'll start. It's 2:17. So hello everyone. I'll speak both on Zoom and in person. Okay. I'll try to do my best in that case. And welcome to the second of 3 classes of Jewish ethics in light of Pirkei Avot. This is a wonderful series where we're actually diving into some interesting, relevant discussions, issues that regard the Jewish world, the international world in general, both in Israel and outside. And we do it in a special method when we learn one Mishna from Pirkei Avot, which is the chapters of our fathers, which is the moral ethic, the most, I would say, essential, basic moral codex that we have in our Jewish library, written as part of the Mishna, which is the ancient halachic book, composed at a little bit after the destruction of the Second Temple. And we'll try to see what the Torah has to say about several issues that we're dealing with. Very interesting issues, very challenging issues. Last week, if you remember, we talked about the fact that there are some students called avrechim, students that learn in a yeshiva, in an academy, in school of Torah, and they're not employed, and they're asking for support from the government, from the state, in terms of daycare, for example, subsidizing daycare, helping with financial allowance, and so goes on and on. We dealt with it last week. Today, I want to shift our discussion to a totally different area, something that I find personally very disturbing and very challenging. It's not going to be an easy class because I think the topic is very, very challenging. I called it, you can see in your sources, I called it, why do wise people do evil things? But I don't want to ask the wide macro moral question about how come good people or wise people can perform sins or bad things. I want to ask it particularly regarding rabbis, regarding learned Jews who learn the Torah, learn halacha, and yet we hear, unfortunately, from time to time about this rabbi or this spiritual leader or this fellow in the Jewish community that transgressed. And it can be with everything. It can be with, for example, financial kind of crimes. It can be bribe. It can be many other stuff. And unfortunately, there are endless examples from the sexual harassment world. That we know there is this rabbi, there was this rabbi or this spiritual leader that just did such an evil thing. And I'm sure we were all shocked. Every time this happens, we're all surprised. I hope we're surprised. I hope we're not assuming that everyone is a potential sex offender, that everyone is a potential crimist. But what happened? How come there are spiritual leaders who learn Torah, learn halacha, learn Jewish studies, and they're expert in those fields. And not only they're experts, they have followers. The public is following them, is admiring them, is actually being inspired by those kind of characters. And we wake up one morning and we find out that such things, evil things, can be done also by them. So I want to ask this very challenging question. There's many, many, many examples in Israel, outside of Israel. You can all, if any of you need any example of something that I'm talking about, please let me know now. But I'm sure you all have one example or another in your heads, in your minds, about someone that you heard on Jewish news, on television, on newspapers in Israel or outside, that this happened. I think that the recent case in Israel, relevant case in Israel, I'm not sure how much you followed, but probably you heard of it, it was on the news that there is a very famous, very well-known famous rabbi who's also an author of children's educational books called Chaim Valder. I don't know if you heard the case of Chaim Valder. Chaim Valder is very, very popular. It was very popular in Israel. His books are in every religious house. In every religious house, he wrote down amazing books. I grew up on his books. He wrote down books, educational books, for parents to educate your children. What happens when the child is sad, or when the parents are sad, and when he's angry, when the child is angry, how to work on yourself, how to grow up, to be a better person. Very, very important stuff. He was very, very famous and very successful. And around 3, 4, 5 months ago, he was accused with sexual harassment of children, of kids, after many, many years where he was number one author and number one rabbi of educational stuff like that in Israel. Unfortunately, this case even didn't get a trial because he committed suicide 2 months after that happened. This is a very, very difficult, very, very challenging case, but it happens. It happened before, it happened these days, and it will happen also, unfortunately, those kinds of stories. So I want to understand why these things happen, try and give a reason of how can we avoid or maybe see before, what does the Torah, not me, I'm not a professional, but what does the Torah have to offer for us, to suggest for us as alarm signs beforehand, so we can see and know, wait, something here is not correct. Something here, as us as followers, is just simple Jews, something here is not correct, and how something like that can happen. I want to use a Mishna from Masechet Avot, because this is our class. Look at the Mishna in source number 1. The Mishna says as follows. It's being said by a rabbi called Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. We'll talk about it. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa in source number 1 says, anyone whose fear of sin precedes his wisdom is enduring. But anyone whose wisdom precedes his fear of sin, his wisdom is not enduring. He also used to say, anyone whose deeds exceed his wisdom is enduring. But anyone whose wisdom exceeds his deeds, his wisdom is not enduring. This is a fascinating Mishnah being said by a rabbi. Think about thousands of years ago, being said by a rabbi that he says there's limits to wisdom. The fact that a person sits all day and learns, and he's wise, and he's amazing, he's brilliant in Torah, he's brilliant in halacha, he's brilliant in Tanakh, that doesn't mean this person will not transgress. We need to understand it. That doesn't mean this wisdom, his wisdom will endure in that case. But I first want to open with a question. What exactly does Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa mean? When he says he wants that the fear, he says in Hebrew, it says, Yirat chet'o. That's what he says, fear of sin. What is the fear of sin? What is the thing? And what is the wisdom? What is the fear of sin? There are different approaches by our sages that are trying to explain what exactly is this fear of sin and this wisdom, and how exactly this system of fear of sin that precedes the wisdom, how exactly that helps to the person that his wisdom will endure and he will not fight. At the end of the day, he will not transgress. So I gave here 4 different answers. I want to go one by one, and I want you to see different, I would say, thinking approaches by our sages about what is the system that Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is offering. So the first one is being in source number 2. The first answer of what does it mean is being brought by Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura, one of the most famous commentators on the Mishnah. And Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura, who was Italian, if you know Bartanura wine, that's not related to him, but he was Italian also. He said as follows. I heard, in source number 2 I'm reading, I heard that it means that he makes his fear of sin precede his wisdom in his thought, that he thinks in his heart. I will study in order that I will be one who fears sin. And this is in the way that they said the beginning of thought is the end of the action. In other words, the Bartanura says something very simple. He said, what do we mean when we say that the fear of sin precedes the wisdom? We mean that his wisdom, when he learns, when he studies Torah, when he studies in yeshiva, in Torah Academy, when he's learning to become a greater Jew, he learns in order not to sin. He's not learning for no purpose. He's not learning in order to be a great rabbi. He's not learning in order to know more of the Torah. He's not learning for his own intellectual kind of enthusiasm. No. He is learning for one specific person, and that reason, that purpose, supposed to be the fear of sin. The first, I would say, motivation. Something that motivates a person to sit down and learn Torah according to the way that Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura is reading this Mishna of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, is that when you sit down and learn, your purpose, your initial purpose is supposed to be the fear of sin, fear not to transgress. This is how the Bartanura, Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura, how he understands Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Look please on the Rambam. The Rambam has another offer, it's suggestion for us. The Rambam in source number 3, the Maimonides, says as follows. Behold, on this Mishnah by Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, he says, behold, this thing is agreed upon by the philosophers. The Maimonides really like the philosophers. He said this is agreed upon by the philosophers as well, that habituation of the virtues, when it comes before acquisition of wisdom, is the point that it is the strong position. And he studies wisdom afterwards, such that it will give him alacrity for those goods, will add joy and love to his wisdom, and industriousness to increase upon it, since wisdom stimulates him to do that to which he is already accustomed. But when the acquisition of knowledge comes first, and he studies the virtues afterwards, his wisdom will prevent him from that which he desires according to his habit. And so wisdom will weigh upon him, and he eventually, says the Rambam, the Maimonides, will live it. In other words, to cut it short, what the Rambam really saying here, what the Rambam is really saying is, first of all, as simple as that, be a mensch. Don't learn Torah before you are a person. There is a level that a human being, doesn't matter if he's Jewish or not Jewish, doesn't matter if he learns Torah, doesn't learn Torah, doesn't matter if he's white or not. First of all, be a decent human being. Before you run and become a posek halacha, someone who decides about halacha, you become a rabbi, you become a leader, you become something, you become a teacher, an editor. First of all, be a mensch, be a person. How he says, it's a very high words, but I think when he says that habituation of the virtues, in other words, just be a mensch, be a person. Know what is right, what is wrong. Know what is good and what is bad. Know what is the common sense, how a human being should act. This is the fear of sin in the eyes of the Rambam, and only then, upon this level, you can build your wisdom. Only upon this system, upon this structure, this basis, those foundations, you can build your wisdom and become a wise person. This is the Rambam's understanding of this Mishnah. Let's see a third option, a third answer by the Maharal of Prague, another one of the biggest rabbis in Prague around 400 years ago. The Maharal of Prague says as follows, and he uses, look please in source number 4, first of all, he uses a quotation from Kohelet, and he says as follows, in source number 4, the verse in Kohelet says as follows, for there is not a just man upon earth that does good and sins not. It's a very important verse from Kohelet. And the Maharal of Prague in source number 5, I understand that as follows. He connects this mission to this pasuk. He says, and there is no righteous man in the world who does good and does not sin. And that is why it says, whose fear of his sin in our Mishnah, that he fears from the sin that he is prepared to transgress. And so there is no objection that it should have said anyone whose fear of sin precedes, etc. He said, in other words, wisdom does not prevent the person to sin. Everyone are liable of transgressing. Anyone can sin, anyone can make mistakes. It can be very, very, very bad mistakes. It can be not so bad mistakes, but we're all human beings. We can all mistake, we can all sin, we can all transgress. There is no reliability for be righteous 100% with no sinning whatsoever. And that's why, before you become a wise person, first of all, work on yourself not to sin. That's a basic of all knowledge. And you understand that from this verse of Kohelet. The fourth approach that I want to offer is by Rabbi Israel Lipschitz. Rabbi Israel Lipschitz wrote a commentary, and he was a commentator on the Mishnah as well. He wrote a commentary called Yachin. He lived around the 1800s, and he said as follows. Look how we understand it. It's very interesting. This is another way of looking at it. He writes as follows. Who says, and in source number 6, who says in his heart, I will read heretical books that are only human wisdom and not sin, found that he considers wisdom more than fear lest he sin. Nevertheless, after being deeply rooted in the sanctity of the Torah and reverence, it is permissible and mitzvah to read in their books. And as our rabbis warned, also in Pirkei Avot, also in the Mishna of our forefathers, know what you will answer to the heresy. In other words, he says, you know what we're dealing with here? We're dealing here with the case of someone who wants to study books that are not Jewish. For example, science, for example, Greek philosophy, for example, someone really wants to open Baruch Spinoza and read what he has to say about critical biblical criticism. Someone wants to open with, Richard Dawkins kind of a book. Someone wants to open books in order to see what other people, which he's calling them heretics, has to say about the world. He says, before you do that, and if you do it, you might be a very wise person. You might be a very, very smart, a brilliant person if you know it. But before that, you need to fill your belly with some holy food. You need to be someone who has basis, foundations in Judaism, has foundations in Torah, has a kind of, I would say, structure that if you're gonna one day face those very, very strong winds that will try and rock your ship, you will be strong enough to stand still when those winds will come and attack you, because you have a basis in Torah, you have a basis in holiness, you have a basis in tefillah and prayer, and that's why you're gonna be fine. This is how Rabbi Israel Lipschitz understands this Mishnah of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. But in general, what I want us to understand from this first part of the class is that when Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said, everyone can sin, and first, before the fact you're a wise person, that doesn't mean your wisdom will endure. That doesn't mean you will be lacking sinning. It wasn't 100%. The commentators were not 100% sure how to understand it and what exactly is the reason that someone should first of all fear of sin and then afterwards, only afterwards, be wise. This is for the first part of our class. That's I'm going to drink. And there is, if someone has any question, I'll take 1 or 2 questions. Yes, Ruchama.
Can I say something?
Please.
God created the human being, and yet God himself said, Yetzer lev Adam ra mineurav.
You're right. You're referring, thank you, Ruchama. You're referring, I will translate, you're referring to a verse from Bereshit saying that our inner, I would say,
inclination
kind of is already been evil from our creation. This passage, this verse that you're referring had in general, it can be discussed a lot. It wasn't so simple with the commentators. We know that the Christians, for example, they took this very thing and that became one of the biggest ideas of Christianity, that we are all today still trying to cover up the sin of Adam and Eve. And that's why we need to confess all the time. And only in days to come, we will be able to cover all of this, because we all have what is called the initial sin, that we all have part of something that we need to, we're all shamed that what happened in when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Adam and Eve. I'm not going to dive into that, you're right, but I would only say that the Jewish explanation to this kind of idea is very complicated. Very complicated what exactly that means, that we were born evil. Can we work on that? Can we not work on that? What exactly is the nature? It's where Torah and psychology are kind of, I would say, blends together, and the lines are very blurred in that kind of sense. I'll not dive more than that, but thank you for that note. Are there any other question before we continue? One more. Yes, Linda.
So when you talk about fear of sin, are you talking about Yirat Shamayim?
When I'm talking about the fear of sin, I'm talking about Yirat Shamayim. Yirat Shamayim is the fear of heaven. I'm talking, again, that's also a very interesting question. What's the difference between the fear of heaven, right? The fear of heaven, the sake of heaven, or the sake of sin? The fear of sin, it's not exactly the same thing. I would just say it's simple. When we talk about the fear of sin, first of all, we don't really understand what it means, because we see that the commentators are trying to explain what does it mean, the fear of sin. I think that any each of us can relate to one at least answer from the 4 answers I just gave, and maybe we can understand this Mishna, this saying that the fear of sin should precede the wisdom, as accordingly to one of those ideas. Very quick question by Nathan, and then I'm going to carry on, but I will give another more time for questions. Don't worry, Nathan.
Doesn't this make the separation why we are not malachim? We're human beings.
First of all, my Kuzari Chavrusa is asking a question from the Kuzari, and we will answer this question in our Chavrusa. What separates between us and the Malachim and the angels? You're right. The fact that angels cannot sin. That's one of the things that is making us not as angels. But we know there are some things that we are even greater than angels for some time. But yeah, this is one of the things. Again, if we believe in angels, which is also something that is very debatable in Judaism, this is something that is also a reason that angels cannot sin and we are. But angels is a very, very, very broad discussion that I'm not willing to bring to the table. But thank you for that question, Ethan. And I'm going to continue, and I'll stop after the second section and we'll have more questions. So please write them down and we will continue. So now I want to take you on a journey to the Torah. Try and understand what is the Torah's approach towards leaders, rabbis that transgressed. I mean, that's not a new invention that rabbis can transgress. That since the invention of rabbis and spiritual leaders, what exactly was the Talmud, the Torah kind of approach to those kinds of stories? The first story I want to deal with is a very, very, very challenging story that probably most of you know. It's the story of David HaMelech, the King David, and Bathsheba. This deserves for itself an entire course, trying to see about the story about David HaMelech. We'll just read very fast, very quickly the verses. It's a very complicated issue. We're not going to dive into it. I'm just going to give one approach from the Talmud. How should we approach this kind of transgression, whether that is or not? Look please on source number 7. This is the first example. I'm reading from Samuel 2, chapter 11, source number 7. The Navi, the prophet, says as follows: late one afternoon, David, means King David, rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, says the prophet, and the king sent someone to make inquiries about the woman. He reported, she is Bathsheba, her name is Bathsheba, daughter of Elam, and wife of Uriah the Hittite. She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. King David, sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him and he lay with her. She had just purified herself and her period, and she went back home. We can all figure out what's going to happen next. The woman conceived and she went word to David, I am pregnant. I'm jumping forward several verses. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Job, which he sent with Uriah. Uriah is the husband of this Bathsheba. He wrote in the letter as follows: place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fire cessed, then fall back so that he may be killed. This is a very difficult, very challenging story about our King David, which we preserve as almost the perfect king. First of all, how come the Torah, the Navi, the prophet, is even telling us this kind of story? Why do we need to know this story about our leader? That's the first thing I want to put down. I want to just say, the Torah told, the Navi, the prophet told us that. That appears in our Tanakh, that appears in our Bible. So we need to know this happened. But the fact that the Navi, the prophet, said it, that is not necessarily going along with the approach that our sages has towards this very challenging story. Look how in source number 8, how the Rabbi Shmuel Barnachmani from the Talmud, how he interprets, how he understands this story. Look what he says. In source number 8, Rabbi Shmuel Barnachmani said that Rabbi Yonatan said, anyone who says that King David sinned with Bathsheba is nothing other than mistaken. As it is stated regarding David in another pasuk, another verse, it says, and David succeeded in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Is it possible, he asks, that sin came to his hand, and nevertheless, the divine presence was with him? In other words, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says as follows, folks, don't think that David HaMelech, that King David, sinned. He cannot transgress. He's a giant. He's a giant. He's above any normal human being. He's someone that lives with the divine presence, with the Shekhinah next to him. Do you think he can transgress? Come on. Of course he didn't. No, not everyone agrees with Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. But I brought this as an example so we can see what happened, that from the fact that the Navi, the prophet, very clearly, and I have to say, don't make any mistake, very clearly showed us this is wrong. How do we know it's wrong? How do we know what David HaMelech did is wrong? First of all, because we have common sense. First of all, we can read and we have our own human intuitions that we can see we're uncomfortable with this kind of story. We're all nudging a little bit when we hear it. But also the prophet, just several verses later, the prophet himself is saying to King David, what you have done is awful. He gives a parable about a person that has only one sheep. That's the only thing he has. And he has a neighbor that has so many sheep. He's so rich. And he gives an example that this very rich person just stole the only sheep that his neighbor had. His poor neighbor had only one sheep and he just stole it. The Navi, the prophet says, David HaMelech, King David, this is exactly what you've done. You're a king. You have everything you want. You took from this poor Uriah the only thing he had, which is his wife. And then you send him and killed him. So we know it was wrong. We know what King David did was not correct by all means. Yet, nevertheless, in the Talmud, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani is trying to shrink the scene and tell us this leader, King David, just cannot sin. It's not something that he has in his nature. This is one how come? How should we approach this kind of I would say, saying from the Talmud? We'll talk about it in a minute. We'll see more examples. But just for us to see that the Torah's kind of approach towards leaders that fail, that transgress, is kind of complicated, I would say, in a sense. Let's see more stories that appear in the Talmud about rabbis, not kings now, not rabbis that transgress. Look, please, on source number 9. There is a very interesting story brought up in the Talmud of Kiddushin, telling us a very, very strong, powerful story about a rabbi that almost transgressed. And look what happens. I'm reading in source number 9. Excuse me. Once, captive women were brought and redeemed in the city of Nahardea in Babylon. They were brought up to the house of Rabbi Amram the Pious. Rabbi Amram the Pious, that was his name. They were brought up to his house, those women. They removed the ladder from before them to prevent men from climbing up after them to the attic where they were to sleep. They put up in their attic to sleep there, and they took up the ladder so no one will come up, and you know what will happen. When one of them passed by the entrance to the upper chamber, it was as though a light shone in the aperture due to her great beauty. In other words, it was very, very beautiful. The Talmud says almost shining of beauty. Out of his desire for her, the host himself, Rabbi Amram, grabbed the ladder that 10 men together could not lift, lifted it on his own, and began climbing. When he was halfway up the ladder, he strengthened his legs against the side of the ladder to stop himself from climbing further, raised his voice, and cried out, There is fire in the house of Amram. There is fire in the house of Amram. Upon hearing this, the sages came and found him in that position between heavens and earth. They said to him, "You have embarrassed us, since everyone sees what you had intended to do." Rabbi Amram said to them, "It is better that you be shamed in Amram's house in this world and not be ashamed of him in the world to come." In other words, Rabbi Amram just told them that should not have happened. And he managed to stop himself halfway on the ladder just before he came to his own attic where he hosted the girls, the women. He managed to stop himself. But he said, "I better be embarrassed in front of all the other sages that came to my house because they just screamed, 'There is fire, there is fire.'" Why did he scream, "There is fire, there is fire"? Obviously because he wanted people to come, so he will know he cannot do what he's trying to do. He just called other people to come to the house because he was weak. He was too weak to stop himself and not transgressing in this specific scene. But the fact that the Talmud is telling us such a story, and it's not just giving up and saying, why should a simple Jew that learns Torah knows this very personal, intimate personal story about Rabbi Amram? But the fact that the Talmud chose to include this story in the Talmud is for us to learn what? That also the rabbis that appear in the Talmud can transgress. But not only that they can transgress, I think even more than that. I think what it's saying here is that the recovery is human. There is no divine presence that can come and save you from such an action. Only you are responsible to yourself. If he would not scream and shout, "There is fire in my house, come and save me," and people will come and see what he's doing, he would not be redeemed and he would not stop from transgressing. But it's not that simple, because at the same page in the Talmud where this story appears, there's two more stories that I found when I learned this page. I found very disturbing because I thought on first glance, oh, that's another story about rabbis that transgress. But then I read again and I paid attention that there is a big difference between that story and the two other stories. And I'll read in source number 10, the first story that appears right after this story. And it says as follows. Source number 10. The Gemara relates, look, another story of a big rabbi, Rabbi Mayer. Rabbi Mayer is a huge rabbi. He appears all the time in the Talmud. We learn, we decide the halacha according to him. And look what story the Talmud is telling us about this personality. The Gemara relates, Rabbi Mayer would ridicule transgressors by saying it is easy to avoid temptation. Look at the opening. Look at the declaration. The Gemara now declares, oh, you know this rabbi that we always mention, that we admire, that we follow him, his decision? He would ridicule transgressors by saying, oh, it's easy not to transgress. And look what the story tells us. One day, Satan appeared to him as a woman standing on the other side of the river. Since there was no ferry to cross the river, he took hold of a rope bridge and crossed the river. When he wanted to get to the pretty woman. When he reached halfway across the rope bridge, the evil inclination left him and said to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaim about you in heaven, be careful with regard to Rabbi Mayer and his Torah, I would have made your blood completely worthless. In other words, this Rabbi Mayer was so close to transgress, he was so close to come and sin with that woman on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the river, but the fact that from heaven they intervened and stopped it made this big rabbi also stop not to transgress. Put that story in your mind. Look at a very similar story that appears one line after, source number 11. Rabbi Akiva now. We all know Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was one of the biggest rabbis of all times. Look what Rabbi Akiva has done. Rabbi Akiva would likewise ridicule transgressors. Come on, this is Rabbi Akiva. He grew up not religious. How come he's doing such a thing? But yet the Gemara, the Talmud is telling us this. Rabbi Akiva would likewise ridicule transgressors. One day Satan appeared to him as a woman at the top of a palm tree. Rabbi Akiva grabbed hold of the palm tree and began climbing. He wanted to reach that woman. When he was halfway up the palm tree, the evil inclination left him and said to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaim about you in heaven, be careful with regard to Rabbi Akiva and his Torah, I would have made your blood completely worthless. Same story. First was Rabbi Mayer, now is Rabbi Akiva, two great sages that we admire until today, and we see that they almost transgressed, but then something happened. But I told you before I read those stories that I think there is a slight, very important difference between those two stories and the first story. I think that while in the first story, when we see a rabbi that transgresses, Rabbi Amram that tried to climb up and he shouted and he screamed, fire in my house, fire in my house, I think this story is very human. This story, by telling us this story, the Talmud is actually telling us everyone can sin. Everyone can sin, but also it's up to them if they want to not sin and they want to not transgress and they want to recover. It's all human and it's all our responsibility. But in the other two stories, there is a fundamental difference. Because in the other two stories, what the Talmud is telling us is totally different. I don't think that the Talmud is telling us in the other stories, oh, you know what? It's not that everyone can sin. No, because at the moment of sin, the moment of transgression, who saves those two rabbis? Not themselves, folks, not their own responsibility. What saves them is divine intervention. What saves them is the fact that heaven said, don't mess up with this rabbi. I think that the Torah, the Talmud, by saying those stories, gives us a reflective approach towards leaders that fail. In those two stories, we understand that maybe rabbis cannot fail. Maybe rabbis are more than that. Maybe rabbis are protected from heaven. And therefore, every time we hear about a rabbi that might sin, it's not him transgressing. No, it's not. Rather, it's his self kind of inclination, kind of, I would say, inner parts that are driving him to do it, but they're being driven by the Satan or by this other divine force, but it's not the human kind of responsibility that is driving them. I think that by this journey, we can see two kind of options. First of all, there's the option of the Torah, of the Navi, that we can see that also great leaders can transgress. We can see that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, for example, there's many sins, not many, but there's some sins that the Torah is telling us that he did. For example, he spoke bad tongue, lashon hara, evil tongue, about what? About what happened, right? Not him, I'm sorry, Miriam, his sister, spoke bad tongue about his wife, about the wife of Moshe Rabbeinu. We see that David Melech, King David, what he has done with Bathsheba. We see that those kind of stories happen, and we can see that not for no reason the Navi, the Torah, the Bible is telling us this. And on the other side, we can see what the Talmud has done with those stories and how it tried to shrink the responsibility of this leader, of this human being, for us maybe understanding as followers that there is something in leaders that you cannot find in any other person, in any other human being. And I think it's very complicated, and I'll try in the last part of the class to offer, again, by returning to Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, offer one way of understanding maybe what does the Torah really wants us to understand from those leaders, and how come leaders can fail, and how comes rabbi can fail, and what are the alert signs that we as followers can have in that sense. I promised some time for questions, so Claudette, please go ahead.
The word sin, what is the Hebrew word for it, and what is the meaning of that word? I think I'm not sure, it's to miss the mark. And if you can explain that for me, I have another thing I would like to say.
What is the meaning?
What is the Hebrew word for sin?
Chet.
Het. And what does it mean?
Sin.
Sin?
Yeah.
The word het means to.
What sin means in English? Why sin is called a sin? I don't know why it's called chet. I assume there's different answers for that. I don't know of any correct answer that I can give you. I don't think there is one correct answer of why this is called chet, but sin in Hebrew is chet. The Torah is calling it.
Het. With the rabbis that the Talmud talk about, it shows that they have a conscience. And I think that conscience comes when we expose ourselves to learning what is right and what is wrong.
I see, but I also think that the conscious is a little bit difficult is not so noticeable in the two stories that I gave about Rabbi Mayer and Rabbi Akiva, because they didn't really understand they're transgressing. I think only by this divine intervention, they really understood that they're sinning in that sense. So I think we can hear both voices from Talmud. I think, and this is what I'm trying to say, that I don't think there is one voice from the Torah that says, oh, leaders cannot I think it's more complicated from that. It's not that simple.
Leaders can say,
simple, but I don't think it's that simple. More questions from the people from the crowd. If anyone has any question. Okay. All right. Claudette, your hand is still up. Do you still want to say something? Okay. So this brings us to the third and last part of this class. And this is after we've been through a journey and trying and understand what exactly Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was saying here in this Mishnah, and trying and see different approaches in the Talmud for transgression off leaders, off rabbis, off giants in Judaism. I want to offer what I believe is an answer to all those kind of complexity, and what I really think beneath all those voices can be one approach that the Torah is giving us, and we can actually maybe put some alert signs from this by understanding, how simple is that, who was Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa? Who was Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa? What brought him to say what he said? What is life? What happened in his life? And what do we know about his personality, about his character? And maybe we can understand really what he was trying to say. Another reason, what he was trying to say when he said that the fear of sin should precede the wisdom. I brought some stories. It was very complicated, I have to tell you, because we will see in a minute. The Talmud has two different storylines about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. It's not so simple who this person was. It's not so simple, and I'll let you see by yourself. Let's start with the first story. The first story appears in Tractate Ta'anit, Masechet Ta'anit in the Talmud. I'm reading in source number 12. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, each and every day a divine voice emerges from Mount Horeb and says, the entire world is sustained by the merit of my son Hanina ben Dosa. And yet for Hanina, my son, a cud of carobs, which is nothing, a very small amount of inferior food is sufficient to sustain him for an entire week, from one Shabbat evening to the next Shabbat evening. In other words, he was very, very poor. The Gemara relates, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's wife would heat the oven every Shabbat evening and create a great amount of smoke due to embarrassment to make it appear that she was baking, despite the fact that there was no bread in her house. She had a certain evil neighbor who said to herself, now I know that they have nothing. What then is all the smoke about? She went and knocked on the door to find out what was in this smoking oven. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's wife was embarrassed, and she ascended to an inner room. A miracle was performed for Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's wife. As her neighbors saw the oven filled with bread and the kneading basin filled with dough, she said to Rabbi Hanina's wife, calling her by her name, so-and-so, so-and-so. She didn't even know her name. Yeah, her neighbor's name. So-and-so, so-and-so, bring a shovel as your bread is burning. She came out and said to her neighbor, oh, I too went inside to bring the shovel. This is the story. The story ends up here. It's a very, I would say, very breaking story in that sense, that you see the woman, she's putting on the smoke, turning on the smoke in her house, so the neighbor will not pay attention. She's not for Shabbos. She has nothing to cook for. So, and then there's a miracle. The story ends up here. Before we read, I know you all have 3 more lines in the story. Wait a minute. But the story ends up here. I think, first of all, just from reading the story, what can we understand about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, his wife, this household? First of all, they had nothing. They were very, very poor, first of all. Second of all, there is no interaction between Rabbi Hanina's wife and God, right? When that happens, we're not being learned that Rabbi Hanina's wife is praying, is asking for any miracle, is saying, please, God, help me make a miracle. She's very, I would say, pragmatic. She's very pragmatic. She's very smart. She says, what can I do? I don't have money, so let me turn on the smoke. And when her neighbor came in, when knocked on the door, she was so embarrassed, she ran away. She didn't even ask for a miracle, but the miracle happened. The story tells us that the miracle just happened as it is, with no request, with no prayer, with no tefillah, just happened by himself. This is the story. But look what happens, because in a later edition, this is very interesting how exactly are the stories being edited in the Talmud. But the story finishes here. But then the Talmud adds another understanding, and later on, many years later, adds another understanding to that story. And it says a Tanatot. Tanatot means there is a rabbi that said after he heard that story, he wanted to say something. What did he want to say? A Tanatot, she too had entered the inner room to bring a shovel because she was accustomed to miracles and anticipated that one would occur to spare her embarrassment. In other words, the rabbi is not understanding the story as I understand it, and by all means, he's not understanding it as a human story that she didn't request any miracles. He's saying total opposite. He's saying, you know what? She rented the inner room, actually really to bring a shovel. She was so used to miracles in her household, she was sure the miracle will happen. Look how different, I think this rabbi in the Talmud, when they edited the story and added this insight, I think the Talmud changed the story 180 degrees, totally different than the original meaning of the story. One story about Rabbi Hanina. Look at another example, also from Masechet Ta'anit, in source number 13. One Shabbat evening, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, another story, saw that his daughter was sad. He said to her, my daughter, why are you sad? First of all, that's a rabbi. He sees his daughter sad and he asks her, why are you sad? That's not taken to granted, folks. That's not taken to granted. But he asked her, why are you sad? She said to him, I confused a vessel of vinegar for a vessel of oil, and they lit the Shabbat lamp was vinegar. Soon the lamp will be extinguished and we will be left in the dark. Because in other words, it's not going to work. They tried to light up vinegar, tried to light up oil. He said, I just ruined my Shabbos candle. We don't have any other candles. And I ruined my candle with vinegar and not with oil. What can I do now? He said to her, my daughter, what are you concerned about? He who said to the oil that it should burn can say to the vinegar that it should burn. End of period, end of story. The rabbi, the father said to his daughter, don't worry, Bezrat Hashem, everything will be fine. We don't know, did it work, didn't it work? Was there a miracle, wasn't there a miracle? He was pragmatic. He said, what can we do now? We don't have any more money to buy more candles or more thing or more oil. That's what we have done. Let's just pray to God. Maybe that can help, maybe that cannot. I think it's a very pragmatic kind of story as well. I think in that story, we don't know if there is a miracle. There isn't a miracle. The story ends up very pragmatic. The daughter is sad. The father is coming to the daughter. He's asking her, why are you sad? And he has nothing to advise her. He has really nothing to say. Just let Bezrat Hashem, God willing, it will work. But look again, the same rabbi that appeared in that story before appears again, and he again has an insight on the story that is totally different than how I understand the entire meaning of the story. And he says, a Tana taught, again a rabbi taught after, many years later when he heard the story, the lamp burned continuously the entire day until they brought from it light for Havdalah. Look what he says. He adds totally different mind to the story, saying not only that what Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said was actually right, they had such a great miracle in that story that this light, this fire catched all the way through Shabbos, all the way until the end of Shabbos for the ceremony of Havdalah, where they used the fire for the candle of Havdalah. I think what he's saying here is Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, he's above nature. When he says something will happen, for sure that happens. But I want to say, it doesn't appear in the original story, and not for no reason. Because from this original story and from the previous original story, the household of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is a very pragmatic house. It's not a house of miracles. They're not asking for miracles. They're not sure there's going to be any miracle at all. She's embarrassed. She's running to the bathroom to hide from her neighbor. And he's pragmatic. He says, oh, God willing, something good will happen, but I don't know. I cannot promise you. It's a very pragmatic household. Look on the third story about Rabbi Hanina's house in source number 14. And it says as follows. The Mishna in Brachot tells us a story. They said about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa that he would pray on behalf of the sick, and immediately after his prayer, he would say, this one shall recover from his illness and live, and this one shall die. When they said to him, from where do you know? He said to them, if my prayer is fluent in my mouth, as I recite it and there are no errors, I know that my prayer is accepted, and if not, I know that my prayer is rejected. That's a very, very difficult question to ask a rabbi. Rabbi, how do you know if your prayers are answered? How do you know if that's right? He's not saying, oh, don't worry, I know, I have connection with God. God speaks with me. I have miracles in my house all the time. I'm lighting up candles from vinegar. I have smoke that creates bread. Don't worry, this is nothing for me to answer you the prayer. That's not his answer. Look what he says. He says, you know what? If I'm fluent, if the prayer is fluent in my mouth, probably it worked. I get in source number 15, again, Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura. Look how he explains it. What does it mean that the prayer is fluent in my mouth? He says in source number 15, if it is ordered or arranged well in my mouth, that is acceptable, and I would not stumble in it. In other words, I just said the prayer as it should be. I didn't do anything. I just believe in God. I just ask everyone to please, if you can.
Get rid of it.
Just mute. It's all fine. So he's not a magician. He's not saying, oh, I believe in miracles. Don't worry, I have connected with God. He just says, I just know because I'm just praying. I'm just a human, simple Jew that has a cedar. I'm opening my cedar. I'm just praying. I'm just davening to God. And things can happen if they happen. That's all. It's a very, very pragmatic kind of rabbi. Same thing happens in a Tosefta. And look again about the editing. Remember we said there is a rabbi later on that changed the story and turned Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa to be a miraculous kind of person. Look here, another very interesting way of understanding how the Talmud is being edited. Look in source number 16. The original story says as follows. They said a story about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa that one day, I read in source number 16, that one day he was standing and praying. Suddenly he was beaten by an arod, by a snake. But he did not stop praying. He continued praying. He was beaten by a snake, but he said, I'm continuing praying. Later, his students went and found the snake, this arod, dead on top of the opening to his hole, where the cave where he lived. The snake, they said, oh, to the man who was bitten by an arod, by a snake, oh, to an arod who was bitten ben Dosa. All right, this is a story. He prayed, he got bitten by a snake, continued praying. Later on, they found the snake dead in the hole and they said, okay, this is probably because Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa continued to praying. Oh, this is not good. Look what happened to the snake that bitten him. Eventually, this snake died. Very simple story, not so many insights we can give from it. But when the Gemara, when the Talmud borrows this story and tells the story about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, there completely changes the entire story, the entire meaning and context, and just look what I would say, how surprisingly, or maybe it's not surprising anymore, because now we know what the Talmud is doing to the stories, but look what the Talmud has done to this very simple story. Look how the Talmud is telling this story in source number 17. Compare it to each other. There was an incident in one place where an arod, again, the snake was harming the people. First of all, look how it opens with this exposition, with this introduction. There was a snake harming many, many people. They came and told Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa and asked for his help. It's not him praying and he's biting. They came to him and asked for his help. He told them, show me the hole of this arod, of this snake. They showed him its hole. He placed his heel over the mouth of the hole and the arod came out and bit him. There is no prayer. There is nothing. That's an entire different setting. The arod, the snake came out and bit him and died. The snake died. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa placed the arod over his shoulder and brought it to the study hall. He said to those assembled there, see, my sons, it is not the arod that kills a person, rather transgression kills the person. And that moment, the sages said, "Oh, onto the person who was attacked by an arod, and oh, onto the arod, the snake that was attacked by Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa." Now, I want to ask you, what happened? Look at the story as it appears in the original text, in the ancient text of the Tosefta, which is like a Mishna, where it's very simple, very pragmatic, very human. He prayed, he bit him, everything was fine. And in the Talmud, they took the same story, changed it completely, turned Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa into this leader that everyone are coming to him. And he helped them, and he wanted to teach them a lesson. He put his heel, and by a miraculous kind of way, this snake died because he bit him. You can see it right after. He brought it to the study hall, to the yeshiva, and he learned them a lesson. What happens here? Why is the Talmud changing the character of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa so much? And who is Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa? And I think this question, the answer for this question is actually an answer for this entire session. Because when we talk about what exactly can be the reason that people follow a leader or a rabbi that eventually transgress, that eventually sins, and they feel such a surprise, something can happen, I think is because this rabbi, if we look at any and each stories, any and each, I would say, biographies, and how he treated his followers, his people, he was not like Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Because Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is lacking what? Is lacking what I want to call messianity. He's lacking the fact that he says, "I'm greater than the divine." When people saw him, according to the original text, to the original stories, he was a very pragmatic person. Although he was a big rabbi, although he was a huge leader, he didn't say, "Oh, you know what? I am bigger than the nature. I'm bigger than the skies. I am greater." He wasn't so charismatic. He wasn't the Messiah. He wasn't claiming to be the Messiah. The people that followed him did not feel he is the Messiah. They did not feel he can be their entire recovery for all their pains. And he was pragmatic. This is the kind of pragmatic rabbi leader. Doesn't need to be a rabbi. It can be a leader. It can be a person that deals with other people. This is the kind of pragmatic person and leader that says, this is the fear of sin. First of all, be a human being, because you're not greater than nature. You're not greater than skies. But the moment there are some leaders, and we can see it almost in every story, that there is a rabbi with followers, both in Israel and beyond. If there is a rabbi or leader where followers are following him so much that they confuse him almost with the divine presence, almost with God. They see him, they see the divine presence, they see him, they feel he is the entire God on earth. Those kind of leadership, those kind of leaders, we should not be surprised that eventually they're the one that transgress, and they are the one that fall, and they are the one that fail. In other words, when Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion said what he said, I think he did try to relate to what we said in Kohelet, and I brought it again at the end of the sources. For there is not a just man upon earth that does good and sins not. I think that what he resembles with his own lifestyle, with his own kind of rabbinical leadership, is the correct leadership. That if we don't see it, if we try and see someone who thinks, or people think of him, that he's greater than heaven, that he is heaven and earth, that he is the divine presence himself, and he is so miraculous, eventually those kind of leaders, they are the first one to fail, and their followers or people are the first one to regret that they followed them. Thank you so much. This was the third session. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming. I'm here for questions if you have. And as I usually like to say, class dismissed. Just please make sure next week there is no class on Monday because it's Victoria Day. We will resume in 2 weeks from now on May 30. Thank you so much. I'm here for questions. Thank you. Wait, let's just in a gallery view. Anyone have any question? You're all fine. Can class dismissed, as I like to say. I just wait for some question if someone has. So
Bye,
one
bye.
second, Danielle. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks very much.